The Americans nearly lost the air war over Europe because they threw away the very thing that could have saved them. October 14th, 1943. Hundreds of B-17 bombers pushed deep into Germany, slow, heavy, exposed like giant buses with no bodyguards. And their bodyguards, U.S. fighters, begin to turn back, not out of fear, but because they're running out of fuel. American crews were being slaughtered, not because they lacked courage, but because of one cold, unforgiving fact. No fighter had the range to stay with them all the way in and all the way home. But here's the part almost no one knows. The aircraft that could solve that problem already existed, and the U.S. Army had officially stamped it unfit, not because it was a bad airplane, but because it had been given the wrong heart. Then one man with no real authority, someone who simply listened to what engines were telling him, did something he was never supposed to do. A technical change that looked small on paper, but was powerful enough to break the Luftwaffe, clear the skies for D-Day, and flip the balance of power over Europe. Stay to the end, and you'll see what that buried secret was, why it was ignored, and how one illegal decision changed the war. After October 14th, 1943, Schweinfurt stopped being just another name on a target list. It became proof that something fundamental in the American air war was broken. The mission itself had not been reckless or rushed. 316 B-17 bombers had crossed the channel in disciplined formation, each carrying 10 men, more than 3,000 lives moving together through hostile sky. The plan depended on a single assumption, that American fighters would protect them all the way in and all the way back. At first, they did. U.S. fighters intercepted German probes, broke up early attacks, and held the air around the bomber stream. But escorting bombers was never about winning the first engagement. It was about staying long enough to survive the last one. As the formation pushed deeper into Germany, the truth asserted itself in a language no pilot could argue with. Fuel gauges fell, engines demanded restraint, and one by one, American fighters turned west. Not because the Germans forced them away, but because physics did. The Luftwaffe had been waiting for this moment. They did not waste strength early. They conserved it, watched, and waited. The instant the escorts peeled off, German fighters attacked with discipline and precision. Bombers that could barely maneuver and could outrun nothing were suddenly alone. Engines erupted in flame. Formations disintegrated. Men jumped into freezing air, and some parachutes never opened. By the time the survivors limped back to England, 60 bombers were gone and 600 airmen were dead or missing. This was not a failure of courage or training. It was a failure of arithmetic. A deep strike into Germany required hours over enemy territory, but American escort fighters simply did not have the range to match that reality. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful, fast, and brutally tough, but it consumed fuel like a racer running an endurance course with a tiny tank. The P-38 Lightning could go farther, but brought its own limitations. No American fighter could stay with the bombers from takeoff to target and back home. That single fact turned every deep penetration mission into a gamble with death. Captain Don Blakesley did not need reports or charts to understand what was happening. He watched bomber crews die while doing everything they had been trained to do. After Schweinfurt, he did not submit a polite request. He delivered an accusation. The Allies needed a fighter that could go to Berlin and return. Until they had one, they were sending men into slaughter. The statement moved through command rooms like a warning no one wanted to hear, because it forced an uncomfortable realization. The Allies were not losing airmen because the enemy was unbeatable. They were losing them because their own system had failed to produce one specific capability. Not better tactics, not more bravery, not a new bomb. They needed range. Without it, no amount of heroism could save the men flying those bombers. And what almost no one knew at the time, what history would later bury beneath paperwork and classifications, was that the solution already existed, not as a future concept, not as a secret project, but as a real aircraft already flying, already proven in other roles, already written off by official evaluations as unsuitable for the very mission that could have ended the slaughter. That judgment would nearly cost the Allies control of the sky. And in the next part of this story, we'll see how it was made, why it was wrong, and how one overlooked decision set the stage for everything that followed. Long before bombers burned over Germany, the story had already begun with a decision that looked confident, rational, and completely wrong. In 1940 and 1941, as Britain fought alone and desperately needed fighters, the British Purchasing Commission approached an American company with a straightforward request: build the Curtiss P-40 under license, as fast as possible. The P-40 was not perfect, but it existed, and time was running out. What the British received instead was an answer that bordered on arrogance. James Dutch Kindleberger, head of North American Aviation, refused. He argued that copying an old aircraft would waste precious time, and that his engineers could design and build something better from scratch within the same window it would take to set up P-40 production. Britain, bleeding and short on options, agreed. They gave him a deadline that most engineers would have considered impossible. What emerged from North Americans' drawing boards was the NA-73, later known as the Mustang. From the beginning, it was different. Its wing used a laminar flow profile that reduced drag far more efficiently than most fighters of the era. Its radiator was mounted beneath the fuselage and shaped to exploit the Meredith effect, converting heated exhaust air into usable thrust instead of pure resistance. The result was an aircraft that was unusually clean, fast, and efficient. When the prototype flew, it did so ahead of schedule, quietly embarrassing skeptics who believed the project could never be completed on time. At low altitude, the Mustang was exceptional. It was fast, responsive, and carried more internal fuel than almost any single-engine fighter then in service. On paper, it looked like exactly the kind of aircraft the Allies needed. But one choice undermined everything. At the heart of the Mustang sat the Allison engine. It was reliable, durable, and familiar to American industry. At low altitude, it performed well. The problem was not craftsmanship. The problem was oxygen. Above roughly 15,000 feet, where modern air combat actually took place, the Allison began to suffocate. Its single-stage supercharger could not force enough air into the engine. As the atmosphere thinned, power dropped sharply. Climb rates collapsed. Speed vanished at precisely the altitude where bombers needed protection the most. This failure was impossible to miss. Test pilots felt it immediately. Reports described the Mustang as lively and impressive below its critical altitude, then increasingly helpless above it. At 25,000 feet, it no longer behaved like a predator. It behaved like prey. In 1942, American evaluators did what evaluators are trained to do. They documented the problem. Their language was calm, methodical, and devastating. The aircraft demonstrated excellent performance at low altitude, they concluded, but its degraded high-altitude capability made it unsuitable for escort or interception against modern European fighters. The recommendation followed naturally: limited procurement, ground attack, and reconnaissance duties only. On paper, the decision made sense. The U.S. Army Air Forces already had fighters they trusted. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a heavily armed brute that could absorb extraordinary damage and still bring pilots home. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines, promised altitude performance and extended range, even if it came with complexity. Compared to these aircraft, the Mustang appeared compromised. Why invest further in a fighter that failed exactly where it mattered most? And so the judgment was made. The Mustang was not canceled outright, but it was sidelined. It flew low-level missions. It took reconnaissance photographs. It hunted trains. It operated far from the bomber formations being torn apart over Germany. While B-17 crews were dying in large numbers, the aircraft that could have changed their fate was quietly classified as unsuitable and pushed aside. This is where the paradox becomes unavoidable. The Mustang was not rejected because it was poorly designed. Its airframe was among the most advanced of the war. Its efficiency, fuel capacity, and handling already hinted at something extraordinary. It was rejected because of a single component choice, made early for reasons that appeared reasonable at the time. No one intended to cripple the aircraft. But no one designed it to breathe at altitude either. From the perspective of bureaucracy, the case was closed. The aircraft had been tested, the data had spoken. Meanwhile, Outside the neat logic of reports and procurement channels, a different kind of understanding existed. Knowledge that came not from paperwork, but from listening to machines under stress, from recognizing what engines needed in thin air, and what they could become if paired correctly. While American officials filed the Mustang away, a small number of engineers and pilots saw something else. They did not see a failed escort. They saw a near-perfect airframe strangled by the wrong power plant. They understood that the flaw was not fundamental. It was specific, and specific problems can be fixed. At the time, that realization carried risk, suggesting that the United States had misjudged its own aircraft was politically dangerous, suggesting that a British engine might be the solution was even worse. Acting on that belief without authorization bordered on insubordination. War production rewarded compliance, not intuition. Systems were designed to prevent improvisation, not encourage it. So the Mustang remained where it was flying low, ignored, officially unsuitable. A footnote inside a massive industrial war effort. Meanwhile, the slaughter over Germany continued, and the need for range became more desperate with every mission. Bombers were built faster, crews were trained faster, and they were sent deeper into enemy territory with the same fatal limitation. The question was no longer whether the system would fail again. It was how many men it would cost before someone finally challenged the decision that had buried the solution. That challenge was coming, and it would not come from a general or a committee. It would come from someone who cared less about procedure than results, someone who looked at the Mustang, listened to its engine struggle for air, and realized the answer was not to redesign the aircraft, but to change its heart. The turning point did not come from Washington, and it did not come from a committee. It came from a man who did not see airplanes as symbols or procurement items, but as machines that either obeyed physics or did not. In the spring of 1943, at an RAF base in Duxford, England, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker encountered the Mustang in the role it had been quietly demoted to, low-level reconnaissance. The pilots flying it treated the aircraft with frustration and resignation. It was fast, they said. It was smooth. It felt right in the hands, but once it climbed above 15,000 feet, it fell apart. At altitude, it was useless. Harker listened. Then he asked for a familiarization flight. Once airborne, he felt what the American reports had missed. The airframe was not merely adequate, it was exceptional. Control responses were immediate, almost intuitive. The aircraft wanted to go faster. It wanted to climb. But as he pulled back on the stick and pushed into thinner air, the engine began to choke. The Allison was not failing. It was suffocating. To Harker, the sensation was unmistakable. He had spent his career listening to engines under stress, and this one was gasping for oxygen it could not get. And that is when the solution became obvious. Harker knew an engine that did not suffer this problem. The Rolls-Royce Merlin had been designed for altitude from the beginning. Its two-stage supercharger forced dense air into the engine, even as the atmosphere thinned. Where the Allison weakened, the Merlin thrived. At 25,000 feet, the difference was not incremental. It was transformative. Harker landed with a conclusion that was both simple and dangerous. The Mustang was not a bad airplane. It was a great airplane being strangled by the wrong engine. Instead of routing his observation through layers of permission, Harker did something that quietly crossed a line. He wrote a technical report that did not hedge its language. The Mustang's airframe, he stated, was superior to any fighter currently in production. Its only limitation was the engine. Replace the Allison with a Merlin, and the result would exceed the performance of anything flying at the time. He recommended immediate trials. The report landed on the desk of Air Vice Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, a man with enough experience to recognize both its brilliance and its political danger. Freeman understood what Harker was really saying. He was implying that the Americans had been wrong, that the solution to their escort crisis already existed, and that it had been dismissed for bureaucratic reasons, not technical ones. Freeman's response was not cautious. He scribbled a short note and forwarded the report onward. This may be the most important recommendation to reach my desk this year. Forget diplomacy. Make it happen. Officially, nothing changed. The United States Army Air Forces responded as expected. They acknowledged the suggestion politely and declined. They were already committed to the P-47 and P-38. Modifying a rejected aircraft, they argued, would waste time and resources. The memorandum closed the case. On paper, the idea was dead. In reality, it had just gone underground. At Rolls-Royce facilities in Britain, engineers made a decision that would never survive a formal approval process. Using a Mustang on loan through Lend-Lease American government property, they removed the Allison engine and began fitting a Merlin in its place. No authorization arrived. None was requested. This was not a clean swap. The Merlin was larger and heavier. Mounts had to be redesigned. Cooling systems re-engineered. Fuel and oil lines rerouted. The nose of the aircraft itself had to be reshaped through trial and error. For months, mechanics worked around the clock, hammering metal, cutting panels, and improvising solutions that no drawing board had approved. They were creating something that should not exist, an American airframe powered by a British heart, a hybrid born not from policy, but from necessity. By October 1943, the conversion was complete. The aircraft, now known as the Mustang Merc X, was ready to fly. Ronald Harker strapped himself into the cockpit of the machine he had effectively willed into existence and took off. The climb told the story immediately. 15,000 feet passed without drama. 20,000 followed. At 25,000 feet, where the original Mustang had collapsed, the new aircraft remained strong. Harker pushed the throttle forward. The result was shocking. The aircraft surged ahead, climbing faster, flying smoother, accelerating into speeds the Allison-powered version could never approach. The Merlin had not merely fixed the problem, it had unlocked the airplane's true nature. When Harker landed, he was shaking not from fear, but from adrenaline. He recorded a simple verdict in his flight notes. "This is the best fighter aircraft I have ever flown." Numbers soon followed emotion. Test data confirmed what Harker felt in the cockpit. Speed increased dramatically at altitude. Climb rate soared. Range remained exceptional. The airplane that had been dismissed as unsuitable now outperformed everything it was compared against. Across the Atlantic, stubbornness began to crack. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, received the British test results and understood the implications immediately. The data could not be argued with. The escort problem had not required a new aircraft. It had required a corrected one. Arnold recognized the scale of the mistake, and he also discovered something unexpected. While the British had been performing their unauthorized conversion, engineers at North American Aviation had been quietly preparing for the same outcome. They had already been coordinating with Packard Motor Car Company, which produced Merlin engines under license in the United States. The moment authorization arrived, they were ready. In November 1943, Arnold ordered immediate action. The Mustang would be converted. Production would begin without delay. Within weeks, American prototypes, now designated the P-51B, were flying comparative trials alongside the fighters that had once overshadowed them. The results were brutal. At altitude, the P-51B was faster than the P-47 and the P-38. But speed was not the revelation. Range was. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers from England to Berlin, fight, and return home with fuel to spare. The arithmetic that had doomed bomber crews for months was suddenly obsolete. The decision was irreversible. Full-scale production began at factories in California and Texas. Assembly lines ran day and night. The fighter that had been written off was now being built in numbers large enough to reshape the war. But acceptance did not come instantly. Veteran pilots were skeptical. The P-47 was a flying fortress, capable of absorbing punishment that would tear other aircraft apart. The Mustang looked lighter, almost fragile by comparison. Its liquid-cooled engine meant a single bullet through the radiator could be fatal. To men used to brute strength, the new aircraft felt like a gamble. Combat erased those doubts quickly. On early escort missions, Mustangs climbed effortlessly to bomber altitude and stayed there. They did not burn fuel at a desperate rate. They did not turn back. They lingered, patrolled, and waited. And, for the first time in the war, German pilots encountered American fighters deep inside Germany that refused to leave. From the German perspective, This was disorienting. For years, Luftwaffe tactics had been built around the predictable limitations of Allied escorts. They waited for the turn-back point. They attacked when bombers were alone. Now that moment never came. Worse, when German pilots assumed the Mustang behaved like the P-47 and committed to familiar maneuvers, they discovered their mistake too late. The Mustang held energy through turns. It climbed back to altitude. It stayed. By early 1944, the implications were undeniable. The illegal modification had worked. The rejected airplane had become the answer. And the balance of power in the air was about to shift permanently. What followed was not simply a better escort. It was a complete change in how the air war would be fought. The real test of any aircraft is not how it performs on paper, but what happens when it meets an enemy that is actively trying to kill it. For the Mustang, that test arrived in the winter of 1943. When the first Merlin-powered escorts began appearing over Germany, nothing else in the Allied arsenal changed. The bombers flew the same routes. The targets stayed the same. The Luftwaffe used the same tactics they had refined for years. The only difference was that this time, the escorts did not leave. At first, German pilots assumed nothing fundamental had changed. They had memorized the silhouettes and limitations of every Allied fighter. If a single-engine American aircraft appeared deep over Germany, it meant only one thing. It would soon have to turn back. The standard response was to wait, conserve fuel, and strike the bombers once they were exposed. That expectation proved fatal. The new escorts lingered. They patrolled above the formations, circling with fuel to spare. When German fighters moved to attack, the Americans were still there, already positioned, already waiting. The first encounters were confusing. German pilots dove, expecting the familiar pattern of disengagement. Instead, the American fighters stayed with them through the dive, held energy through the turn, and climbed back to altitude without hesitation. This was not how U.S. escorts were supposed to behave. Reports began filtering back through Luftwaffe units, describing an American fighter that did everything the old ones did but refused to leave. The numbers followed quickly. In early comparative trials, the Mustang demonstrated a brutal advantage. At escort altitude, it was significantly faster than the Thunderbolt and the Lightning. More importantly, its combat radius redefined the battlefield. With external fuel tanks, it could fly from England to Berlin, fight over the target area, and return without scraping empty. The bomber streams were no longer outrunning their own protection. The math that had governed bomber losses for years was suddenly obsolete. The effect on bomber survival was immediate. Missions that once lost 10 or 20% of their aircraft began returning with losses under 4%. What had been a statistical death sentence turned into a survivable operation. Crews noticed the difference instantly. Instead of watching their escorts vanish at the worst possible moment, they saw them remain overhead, weaving through the formation, engaging attackers before they could close. For the Luftwaffe, the shock was profound. Years of tactical certainty collapsed. German pilots found themselves fighting escorts that could choose when to engage and when to disengage. If the fight turned unfavorable, the Americans simply accelerated away, climbed, repositioned, and returned on their own terms. The initiative shifted decisively. Air combat stopped being a defensive struggle for the bombers and became a hunt led by the escorts. By early 1944, Allied commanders recognized what had happened. The escort was no longer just a shield, it was a weapon, and that realization triggered the most aggressive shift in air doctrine of the war. Escort fighters were no longer ordered to stay glued to bomber formations at all times. Instead, they were unleashed. The new directive was simple and ruthless. Destroy the German Air Force wherever it could be found. Fighters began flying far ahead of the bombers, sweeping the skies, attacking German aircraft as they formed up, and even striking airfields themselves. The range that once saved bombers now strangled the Luftwaffe. German pilots could no longer wait safely near their bases. The fight followed them from takeoff to landing. Loss ratios tell the story better than rhetoric. Units flying the new escort achieved kill ratios that had previously been unimaginable. For every Mustang lost, more than 10 German aircraft were destroyed. Other American fighters performed well by earlier standards, but nothing matched the sustained effectiveness of the new escort. The Luftwaffe was not merely being challenged, it was being bled. The psychological impact was just as severe. German pilots, many of them veterans with years of combat experience, began to describe a sense of inevitability. The American fighters were everywhere. They could not be outrun. They could not be avoided. They could not be lured into fuel traps. Each mission eroded the Luftwaffe's remaining cadre of experienced airmen, and Germany lacked the training pipeline to replace them. By March 1944, the consequences reached their breaking point. Major air battles over Berlin revealed a sky fundamentally transformed. Bombers pushed deeper than ever before, and the escorts were already waiting when German fighters rose to meet them. Losses that once mounted steadily now collapsed. The German High Command issued directives urging pilots to avoid prolonged engagements with the new American fighters. Attack quickly, disengage immediately, preserve what remained. But there was nowhere left to run. The Mustang's speed and range allowed it to pursue retreating aircraft back to their bases. German jets, faster on paper, discovered their own vulnerability during takeoff and landing. The escorts loitered overhead for hours, striking aircraft when they were slow, heavy, and exposed. Technological leaps meant nothing without freedom of movement, and freedom of movement was now an American monopoly. As spring approached and preparations for the invasion of Europe accelerated, the air war quietly reached its conclusion. When Allied troops finally crossed the Channel on D-Day, they looked up and saw something unprecedented. The sky was empty of enemy aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, managed only a handful of sorties. The airspace belonged entirely to the Allies. This did not happen because Germany stopped building airplanes. It happened because the airplanes it built could no longer survive. The Mustang did not win the air war by itself, but it made victory inevitable by removing the one constraint that had kept the Luftwaffe alive: sanctuary. By the end of the war, the numbers were staggering. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground. Loss rates dramatically lower than any previous escort. More importantly, thousands of bomber crews who survived missions that would have killed them a year earlier. Fathers returned home, sons lived to grow older. The effect cannot be measured only in wreckage, but in lives preserved. And yet beneath all the statistics lies a simpler truth. None of this was supposed to happen. The aircraft that made it possible had once been dismissed as unsuitable. Its transformation began with an action that violated procedure and ignored approval chains. The decision that saved the air war was not born from consensus. It was born from someone willing to listen to a machine instead of a report. By the time the consequences became visible to everyone, the war in the air was already over. The outcome had been decided months earlier, the moment the escorts stopped turning back. What remained was the final irony. The weapon that crushed the Luftwaffe was not a revolutionary new invention. It was a correction, a single, unauthorized change that allowed an already brilliant design to become what it had always been capable of being. And in the final act, we will confront what this story really means, not just for the war, but for how wars are won at all. By the time the war in the air ended, most of the men who had argued against the Mustang no longer argued at all. The evidence was too complete. The skies over Europe belonged to the Allies, and everyone knew why. But history has a way of smoothing over uncomfortable details, and the deeper truth behind that victory was never quite as clean as official summaries suggested. The Mustang did not win because it was perfect. It won because it was allowed to become what it already was. Its success was not the result of a grand plan, but of a correction made late, under pressure, and against procedure. The war was not turned by a bold new doctrine, or a secret weapon revealed at the last moment. It was turned by admitting quietly that a previous decision had been wrong. That admission saved lives. When bomber losses fell, the effect rippled far beyond statistics. Crews who once climbed into aircraft, knowing their odds were stacked against them, began returning home in numbers that would have been unthinkable months earlier. The rhythm of missions changed. Squadrons stopped bleeding themselves dry. Experience accumulated instead of disappearing in fireballs over Germany. The Allied air campaign stopped being a slow-motion sacrifice and became a sustained, survivable pressure. On the German side, the collapse felt just as sudden. Pilots who had once controlled when and where fights happened found themselves hunted from engine start to landing rollout. Airfields were no longer safe. Altitude was no longer protection. Speed was no longer escape. Every advantage that had kept the Luftwaffe alive had been neutralized not by a miracle, but by endurance. The enemy simply stayed longer. This shift mattered more than any single battle. It made D-Day possible. It made the invasion survivable. It ensured that when Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, they would not be torn apart from the air. The silence above those beaches was not an accident. It was the end state of a decision chain that began years earlier, with a fighter that was judged too limited to matter. That is the irony at the center of this story. The aircraft that broke the German Air Force was once dismissed because it failed to meet a requirement it was never designed to meet. Instead of asking whether the requirement was wrong, the system labeled the machine a failure and moved on. The fix did not require a new philosophy or a new factory. It required admitting that the problem was narrower than anyone wanted to believe. One engine, one component, one assumption, and one person willing to ignore the rules long enough to test a different answer. The lesson here is uncomfortable, especially in war. Large systems are built to eliminate risk, but they also eliminate intuition. Committees do not listen to engines. Reports do not feel vibration. Checklists cannot sense when a machine wants to do more than it is being allowed to do. Those insights come from people close enough to the work to notice when something is almost right. The Mustang was almost right. That almost cost hundreds of lives before it was corrected. And once corrected, it ended the air war faster than anyone had predicted. By the end of the conflict, the numbers told a story that could not be softened. Thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed. Loss rates far lower than any other American fighter. More importantly, tens of thousands of men who came home alive because they were no longer abandoned over enemy territory. Pilots who went on to live full lives not because they were braver than the ones who died before them, but because the math had finally changed in their favor. And yet, the men who made that change did not become legends. The test pilots returned to obscurity. The engineers went back to their drafting tables. The mechanics who worked nights reshaping metal never saw medals. Even the decision-makers who finally authorized production rarely spoke about the delay that made it necessary. It was easier to celebrate victory than to examine how close it came to being lost. History often frames innovation as a clean arc: problem, invention, triumph. The Mustang does not fit that pattern. Its story is messier, more human, and more instructive. It shows how often progress depends not on new ideas, but on correcting old ones. How many wars are decided not by brilliance, but by the speed at which mistakes are acknowledged. The Allied victory in the air was not inevitable. It was earned through correction, through the willingness, however reluctant, to admit that the wrong decision had been made, and to act before the cost became unbearable. When you see a Mustang flying today, polished and restored, it is easy to treat it as a symbol of dominance. But that image hides its real legacy. It was not born dominant. It was born misunderstood. Its greatest achievement was not raw performance, but persistence, the refusal of a design to be discarded before its potential was fully understood. In the end, the Mustang did exactly what was asked of it once the right question was posed. It went all the way in, and it came all the way home. That single change reshaped the war in the air, shortened the conflict on the ground, and ensured that when history turned, it turned decisively. Not because of bureaucracy, not because of consensus, but because someone finally listened to the machine and corrected the mistake that nearly cost everything. When the war finally ended, no announcement marked the moment the air war was truly won. There was no ceremony for the decision that changed everything. No parade for the engineers who rewired a fighter in secret, or the test pilot who trusted his instincts over official conclusions. History moved on, and paperwork buried the details. But the men who flew those missions never forgot the difference. They remembered what it felt like when escorts stopped turning back. They remembered looking out over enemy territory and realizing for the first time that they were not alone. They remembered coming home alive from missions that would have killed them a year earlier. The P-51 Mustang did not end the war by itself, but it removed the one thing that made the war unwinnable in the air. It gave bombers time, it gave crews protection, and it gave the Allies something they had been missing since the beginning: control. That control didn't come from a miracle weapon or a perfect plan. It came from fixing a mistake, from listening to reality instead of reports, from understanding that sometimes the difference between failure and victory is not innovation, but correction. Thousands of men lived because someone was willing to admit that a decision made sense on paper, but not in the sky. That is why this story matters. Not because it glorifies a machine, but because it reveals how close history came to going another way. How often wars are shaped not by the loudest voices, but by quiet acts of defiance carried out in hangars, test flights, and late-night workshops. If this story changed how you see the air war in World War II, there are many more like it moments where small decisions, overlooked people, and unapproved ideas altered the course of history. If you want to keep exploring those hidden turning points, consider staying with us. And if there's another forgotten weapon, aircraft, or decision you think deserves a closer look, leave a comment below. Every story remembered is one less lesson lost. And sometimes, remembering is the difference between repeating a mistake and correcting it in time.